In the heartland of America, where small towns thrive quietly under open skies, Cedar Grove was an unassuming on the map. A place where neighbors waved from porches, businesses opened with the dawn, and the hum of the airport provided a steady rhythm to daily life. But beneath this serene surface, a storm was brewing, one that would test the strength and resolve of a community already accustomed to being overlooked. The arrival of a notorious motorcycle gang, the Steel Riders, seemed like the beginning of a bad chapter for Cedar Grove. What the townsfolk didn't realize was that the bikers were only the tip of the spear. A cover for the Navarro cartel, a sprawling criminal empire with ambitions to turn the town into the keystone of their illicit operations. And their chosen pawn? Bob Anderson, a 72-year-old cargo pilot whose quiet demeanor and graying hair made him an easy target, or so they thought. But Bob wasn't just any pilot. Beneath his unassuming exterior lay a man who had faced storms most could never imagine. A retired Air Force legend, Bob had flown some of the most dangerous missions in history, where precision and resolve were the only things separating life from death. Now, the skills he thought he had left behind would become the town's first line of defense. As the cartel tightened its grip, it unleashed violence, corruption, and chaos to crush resistance. But the people of Cedar Grove refused to bow. Under Bob's quiet leadership, the town found its strength in unity, its courage in adversity. Together, they transformed their vulnerability into an impenetrable shield, proving that no force, no matter how dark or powerful, could extinguish the light of a community standing together. This is a story of resilience and redemption, of ordinary people defying extraordinary odds. But with every move the cartel made to break Cedar Grove, it only revealed deeper layers of its empire, and the secrets Bob had kept hidden for years. What happens when the shadow of a cartel falls on the wrong town? When one small community becomes the spark that sets an empire ablaze? As Cedar Grove rises, the stakes grow higher, the dangers more imminent, and the fight more personal. It's a battle not just for survival, but for the soul of a town, and for the legacy of a man who refuses to let the light go out. The question is, how far can ordinary people go when faced with extraordinary darkness? And at what cost? The storm is coming, but Cedar Grove is ready. Are you? The town of Cedar Grove, nestled in the expansive plains of Montana, was a place where life moved slowly. It wasn't the kind of town where news broke, it trickled. The Cedar Grove Regional Airport was no different. Small cargo planes came and went, hauling supplies to isolated towns and back. At the heart of its operations was Bob Anderson, a man who seemed as quiet and unassuming as the town itself. At 72 years old, Bob looked every bit the retired pilot he was. His gray hair was always neatly combed under a worn cap, and his blue eyes, though sharp, carried the weight of years lived in the skies. To the townsfolk, Bob was just another old-timer. Someone who'd traded his military uniform for overalls and a wrench. He liked it that way. Bob began his morning ritual as he always did, meticulously inspecting his aircraft. His hands, weathered but steady, moved across the fuselage with practiced precision. Routine is what keeps a pilot alive, he often said, though few knew how deeply he meant it. Morning, Bob. Diana Martinez, the airport's operations manager, called out as she approached with a clipboard. Morning, Diana, Bob replied without looking up. Your manifest is clear for the Billings run. Everything okay? Bob hesitated, his gaze lingering on the airport's perimeter fence. 3 motorcycles were parked near the edge, their riders casually leaning against them. They weren't local. He had seen those bikes 2 days ago, and again yesterday. 3rd time this week, Bob muttered, tapping the landing gear with his wrench. Same bikes, same time. Watching the operation, Diana frowned, glancing toward the gate. You think they're casing the place? Bob nodded slightly, though his face betrayed no alarm. Not yet, but call Sheriff Cooper. Tell him we might have company. That afternoon, Bob caught sight of the bikers again. This time, they weren't outside the fence. They had entered the property, engines rumbling as they rolled onto the tarmac. Afternoon, Mr. Anderson, said the man leading the group, a burly figure with a patch on his leather jacket that read Steel Riders MC. His voice carried the gravelly tone of someone used to giving orders. The others flanked him, their faces obscured by sunglasses and arrogance. Bob set his wrench down and straightened. Afternoon. The leader introduced himself as Wolf. He wasted no time cutting to the chase. We've been watching you, old man. You've got a nice little operation here. Legitimate. Clean. Perfect for moving extra cargo. I move what's on the manifest, Bob replied evenly. Wolf smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. We're not asking. Just making a suggestion. There's a lot of money in expanding your services. All we need is for you to look the other way. Bob met Wolf's gaze, unflinching. Not interested. Wolf stepped closer, his voice dropping to a growl. Careful, old man. Accidents happen, even to experienced pilots. Bob didn't respond. Instead, his eyes flicked to the man standing behind Wolf. Miguel Sanchez, a sharply dressed man who seemed out of place among the bikers, was watching the exchange with a cold, calculating expression. Let's not make this unpleasant, Sanchez said, his voice smooth. Think about it, Mr. Anderson. You've got 24 hours. As the group left, Bob stood in silence, his mind already racing. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to use him or his planes, but this time felt different. Later that evening, Bob sat in his modest office overlooking the runway. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the tarmac. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. Catherine Walsh, came the voice on the other end. Agent Walsh, this is Bob Anderson, he said, his voice calm but firm. Bob? It's been years. What's going on? I've got a situation, Bob said, and I think you'll want to hear about it. As Bob outlined the events of the day, Catherine listened intently. By the end of the call, she was already planning her next steps. All right, she said. I'll send a team to monitor the area. But Bob, you need to be careful. These people don't play games. Bob chuckled softly. Neither do I. He hung up the phone and looked out the window again. The bikers thought they were dealing with a helpless old man. They didn't know he had commanded the most dangerous C-130 missions in military history. As the runway lights flickered on, Bob's expression hardened. Let them think they're in control, he murmured. For now. The morning air at Cedar Grove Airport was crisp, with a faint mist lingering over the runway. Bob Anderson, as usual, was already at work, inspecting his cargo plane for the day's deliveries. But his usual calm was undercut by an uneasy tension. Morning, Bob. Diana Martinez approached with her usual clipboard, but her voice was quieter than normal. Sheriff Cooper stopped by earlier. He said he's keeping an eye out, but, she hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. Those bikers were circling again last night. Bob tightened a bolt on the plane's landing gear and stood, wiping his hands on a rag. They're not just circling, Diana. They're watching for patterns, timing our operations. Her eyes widened. What are you going to do? Bob's expression remained calm, almost detached. What I always do. Let them make the first mistake. By midday, the bikers were back. This time, for motorcycles and a black SUV rolled onto the tarmac. The engines rumbled to a stop as Wolf dismounted, followed by his usual entourage. Miguel Sanchez emerged from the SUV, his suit impeccably pressed, his demeanor as cold and calculated as ever. Bob stepped out from the hangar, his posture steady and confident. Mr. Anderson, Sanchez began, his voice carrying a faint accent. I trust you've had time to consider our offer. Bob's face was unreadable. I told you. Not interested. Wolf stepped forward, his hand resting on the buckle of his belt. Maybe you didn't hear us the first time, old man. This isn't a negotiation. Sanchez raised a hand, silencing Wolf. Let's not be hasty. He turned his gaze to Bob, his tone dangerously calm. Mr. Anderson, we're businessmen. We prefer partnerships, not conflicts. But you're forcing us to take alternative measures. Bob didn't flinch. Alternative measures like vandalizing my property? You've been sloppy. Sheriff Cooper's already looking into you, and I've got federal friends who'd love to know more about your business. For a brief moment, something flickered in Sanchez's eyes, surprise, maybe even doubt. But he quickly recovered. You've got 24 hours to reconsider, Sanchez said, his voice sharper now. After that, we'll stop being polite. With that, The group turned and left. Their engines roared as they disappeared down the road. Bob stood in silence, his mind already calculating his next move. That evening, Bob sat in his office, the familiar hum of the airport's machinery a faint backdrop to his thoughts. On his desk were old files, photographs, maps, and mission reports from his days in the Air Force. Each document told a story of danger, precision, and survival. He picked up the phone and dialed a secure number. "Agent Walsh," a familiar voice answered. "Catherine, it's me again," Bob said. "Things are escalating faster than I expected." "Tell me everything," she said. Bob explained the latest encounter with the Steel Riders and Sanchez. Catherine listened in silence before responding. "This isn't just a biker gang, Bob," she said. "Sanchez is connected to the Navarro cartel. If he's involved, this isn't about petty smuggling. They're expanding their operations, and you're in their way." Bob leaned back in his chair, his face thoughtful. "Then we need to make this their biggest mistake yet." "Careful, Bob," Catherine warned. "These people don't just back down. They'll come at you hard." Bob smirked. "Good. It's been a while since I've had a real challenge." The next day, Sheriff Jack Cooper arrived at the airport. A tall, rugged man in his 50s, Cooper carried himself with the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had seen plenty of trouble in his time. "You called for backup?" Cooper asked as he joined Bob in the office. Bob nodded and handed him a folder. Inside were photographs of the bikers, timestamps of their appearances, and details about the black SUV. "They've been scoping the place for weeks," Bob explained. "Sanchez is their handler." "Navarro cartel?" Cooper's jaw tightened. "Figures. These gangs don't usually work alone." Bob leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "I need you to trust me on this, Jack. Let them think they're in control. Let them feel safe. They'll slip up, and when they do, we'll have them." Cooper studied Bob for a long moment before nodding. "You've got a plan, don't you?" Bob's smirk returned. "Always." That night, the bikers made their boldest move yet. 4 motorcycles and 2 SUVs returned, this time entering the hangar itself. Wolf dismounted first, swaggering in with his typical bravado. "This is your last chance, Anderson," Wolf growled. "You either play ball, or we start playing rough." Bob stood his ground, his expression calm and unshaken. "You should look up the term asymmetric warfare," he said evenly. "Might save you some trouble." Wolf sneered. Big words for a guy who's about to lose everything. But Sanchez was less sure. He studied Bob carefully, noting the old pilot's unwavering confidence. Something about Bob's calm demeanor didn't sit right with him. "Come on," Sanchez ordered, pulling Wolf back. "We'll handle this another way." As the vehicles disappeared into the night, Bob stepped back into his office and picked up the phone. "Catherine," he said, his tone resolute, "it's time to set the trap." That same night, a black SUV parked in a remote location outside Cedar Grove. Inside, Sanchez made a call. "He's not what we thought," Sanchez said, his voice low. "Anderson isn't just some old man running cargo. There's more to him." The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "Then make sure he doesn't live long enough to become a problem." As Sanchez ended the call, he stared out into the darkened plains, his jaw tightening. This wasn't going to be as simple as they thought. Back at the airport, Bob Anderson sat alone in his office, staring at an old photograph of his Air Force unit. The inscription read, "To those who fight with precision, patience, and unyielding resolve." Bob smiled faintly and whispered to himself, "Let's see how well they play when they're the ones being hunted." The morning after the Steel Riders' latest visit, the Cedar Grove airport was unusually quiet. A heavy tension hung in the air as Bob Anderson methodically performed his pre-flight checks. Every movement was deliberate, but his mind raced with possibilities. He knew the cartel wouldn't wait long to make their next move. Diana Martinez appeared in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. "Sheriff Cooper just called. He says there have been reports of cartel activity at other small airports nearby. Intimidation, vandalism, even some violence." Bob set down his clipboard, his sharp gaze meeting hers. "That's them expanding their network. They're pushing to control transport hubs. It's standard cartel strategy." She hesitated before asking, "And us?" Bob's voice was steady. "We're their biggest obstacle. They'll hit us next. Later that day, Catherine Walsh arrived at the airport in an unmarked SUV. The FBI agent, dressed in a plain black jacket, blended in easily among the locals. Her sharp eyes missed nothing as she stepped out of the vehicle. "Good to see you, Bob," Catherine said as she approached. "Wish it were under better circumstances," Bob replied, shaking her hand. "What's the latest?" Catherine handed him a file. "We've confirmed Sanchez is tied to the Navarro cartel. They're using the Steel Riders as their foot soldiers. But it's worse than we thought. The cartel isn't just looking to expand. They're consolidating their operations. Cedar Grove is supposed to be a critical hub." Bob skimmed the file, his expression hardening. "If they lock down this airport, they control a whole region." Catherine nodded. "And they'll stop at nothing to make that happen." As the two discussed strategy, Sheriff Cooper joined them, his face grim. "Got something you need to see," he said, holding up his phone. On the screen was a security camera recording from a nearby truck stop. The footage showed a familiar figure, Miguel Sanchez, talking with a man in an FBI jacket. Catherine's jaw tightened. "That's Greg Harper. He's one of mine." Bob frowned. "You trust him?" Catherine hesitated. "I thought I did. He's been with the Bureau for years, but this doesn't look good." Bob's instincts took over. "If Harper's compromised, Sanchez knows more about our operations than we think." The next day, Catherine discreetly reviewed Harper's activity within the Bureau. What she found only deepened her concern. Harper had accessed sensitive files related to cartel investigations, including Cedar Grove's case. "He's feeding them intel," Catherine said, slamming the folder shut in frustration. Bob, ever calm, leaned back in his chair. "We don't need to expose him yet. Let him think he's still under the radar. He'll lead us straight to Sanchez." Catherine hesitated. "That's a risky move, Bob." "Riskier to let him operate unchecked," Bob replied. "We'll keep him close and control what he sees." Meanwhile, Miguel Sanchez was growing restless. At a remote safe house, he paced as he spoke into his phone. "This Anderson isn't just an obstacle. He's a problem," Sanchez said, his voice tense. "We've underestimated him." On the other end of the line, Ortega, the Navarro cartel's regional commander, was less forgiving. "Handle it, Miguel. No more delays." Sanchez clenched his jaw. "We have a man inside the FBI. He'll help us take Anderson down." "You'd better hope so," Ortega replied coldly. As Sanchez plotted, Bob was preparing a counteroffensive. In his office, he laid out a detailed map of Cedar Grove and the surrounding areas. Marked with pins and notes, it showed every known point of cartel activity. Michael O'Brien, Bob's old Air Force mechanic, entered the room, wiping grease from his hands. "Looks like you're gearing up for another mission," Michael said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Feels like old times," Bob replied. "You still good with electronics?" Michael raised an eyebrow. "What are you thinking?" "We need surveillance on our mole," Bob said. "If Harper's working with Sanchez, we need to know everything he's doing." Michael grinned. "I'll get started." That evening, Bob and Catherine set their trap. They fed Harper carefully curated information about a shipment arriving at the airport, knowing he'd relay it to Sanchez. Sure enough, the following night, 2 SUVs pulled onto the tarmac. Sanchez and Wolf emerged, flanked by armed men. "Evening, Mr. Anderson," Sanchez said, his tone sharp. "I hear you've got something interesting for us tonight." Bob, standing near his plane, gave a small smile. "Sorry to disappoint, but you've been misinformed." Before Sanchez could respond, floodlights illuminated the area. Catherine and a team of FBI agents stepped out of the shadows, weapons drawn. "Drop your weapons," Catherine ordered. The cartel's men hesitated but complied when they saw they were surrounded. Sanchez, however, remained calm. "Well played," he said, raising his hands. "But this isn't over." Despite the successful operation, Bob and Catherine knew the cartel wasn't finished. Back at the airport, they debriefed with Sheriff Cooper and Michael. "They'll come back harder now," Catherine warned. "Sanchez will report this to Ortega, and he won't take it lightly." Bob nodded. "Good. Let them escalate. The more they push, the more mistakes they'll make." Michael glanced at Bob. "And what about Harper?" Bob's expression darkened. "We deal with him next." As the night settled over Cedar Grove, Bob stood by the runway, watching the stars. He knew the fight was only beginning. The cartel was dangerous, but Bob had faced worse. They think they've got the upper hand, he murmured to himself. They don't know what's coming. From the shadows, Diana approached cautiously. Bob, are we ready for this? Bob turned to her, his face calm but resolute. We don't have a choice. They came to the wrong town. The distant hum of an approaching plane signaled another routine delivery. But for Bob, Cedar Grove was no longer just an airport. It was a battleground. The aftermath of the previous night's raid left the Cedar Grove airport buzzing with activity. FBI agents combed through evidence collected during the operation, while Sheriff Cooper coordinated with local deputies to secure the perimeter. Despite the victory, Bob Anderson knew this was only the beginning. They'll regroup, Bob said, standing with Catherine Walsh in the airport office. He pointed at a map spread across the table, marked with pins and notes. The Navarro cartel doesn't take humiliation lightly. Their next move will be bigger, bolder. Catherine nodded, scanning the map. I've seen it before. They'll escalate to make an example out of you. That's what I'm counting on, Bob replied calmly. Later that day, Michael O'Brien worked quietly in the hangar, installing surveillance cameras in inconspicuous places. Bob stood nearby, overseeing the process. You really think they'll take the bait? Michael asked, glancing at Bob. They have to, Bob replied. They've spent too much effort setting up their operation here. Losing Cedar Grove would make them look weak. Michael chuckled. You always had a knack for turning the enemy's strength into their weakness. Bob smirked. Old habits die hard. By the evening, Bob and Catherine finalized their strategy. Using Harper, the compromised FBI agent, they fed false information to Sanchez about a lucrative shipment passing through Cedar Grove. Are you sure this will work? Catherine asked as they reviewed the plan. They're desperate to save face, Bob said. Desperation makes people predictable. Sanchez will take the bait because he has no choice. Catherine hesitated. And if Ortega steps in? Bob's expression hardened. Then we'll deal with him too. The next night, the trap was set. A small cargo plane, seemingly loaded with valuable goods, sat in the hangar. Lights were dimmed, and the airport appeared deserted. Hidden cameras recorded every approach, and FBI agents, disguised as maintenance workers, kept watch. Shortly after midnight, the rumble of motorcycles and SUVs broke the silence. The Steel Riders, led by Wolf, arrived first, followed by Sanchez and his armed men. Bob watched from the shadows, his sharp eyes tracking every movement. Showtime, he murmured. Wolf dismounted his bike, his swagger as bold as ever. Well, look who's ready to play ball, he sneered, gesturing toward the cargo plane. Sanchez stepped forward, his expression cold and calculating. This better be worth my time, Anderson. Bob emerged from the shadows, his posture calm but commanding. Oh, it will be. As the cartel's men moved toward the plane, floodlights blazed to life, illuminating the entire hangar. FBI agents stepped out from concealed positions, weapons drawn. Freeze! Catherine's voice rang out. Chaos erupted as cartel operatives and bikers scrambled for cover. Sanchez cursed under his breath, realizing he'd been outplayed. Despite the surprise, Sanchez maintained his composure. Clever Anderson, he called out, raising his hands slowly. But you won't win this war. Wolf, less controlled, snarled, This ain't over, old man. Bob, standing firm, replied evenly, Oh, it's over for you. You just don't know it yet. FBI agents moved in, handcuffing several bikers and cartel members. But Sanchez and Wolf slipped away in the chaos, retreating into the darkness. Back in the airport office, Catherine debriefed her team. We've got plenty of evidence from tonight. Enough to link Sanchez directly to the Navarro cartel. But we didn't catch him, Diana said, worry etched on her face. He got away. Bob, seated at his desk, looked up from a file. We let him get away. Catherine frowned. You wanted him to escape? Bob nodded. He'll go straight to Ortega, and Ortega will be forced to act. They'll consolidate their resources, which makes them easier to track. Catherine crossed her arms. You're playing a dangerous game, Bob. He leaned back, his gaze steady. It's the only game they understand. Meanwhile, Sanchez returned to a safe house on the outskirts of the region, where Ortega awaited him. The cartel boss was a man of precision and power, his every word measured. "You failed," Ortega said, his voice icy. Sanchez clenched his fists. "Anderson is more dangerous than we thought. He's using the FBI to block us at every turn." Ortega studied him for a moment before replying, "Then we'll remove him from the equation. Permanently." The following day, Sheriff Cooper brought troubling news to Bob and Catherine. "We've had reports of increased cartel activity at truck stops and small airfields in the area," Cooper said. "They're building up for something." Bob nodded. "They're testing their options, looking for vulnerabilities." Catherine added, "We need to stay ahead of them. If Ortega's getting involved, this won't just be about Cedar Grove anymore." Bob's expression was resolute. "Then we make Cedar Grove their biggest mistake?" By nightfall, Bob and his team were back at work, reinforcing their defenses and preparing for the next strike. Michael installed additional surveillance equipment, while Catherine coordinated with federal agents to monitor cartel communications. In the quiet moments, Diana approached Bob, her face troubled. "Are you sure we're ready for this? They're going to come at us with everything they have." Bob glanced at her, his voice calm. "That's exactly what we want." Diana hesitated, then nodded. "You always seem to be one step ahead." Bob smiled faintly. "Not always, but I make sure they think I am." Across the region, cartel operatives and steel riders gathered, their forces growing stronger by the hour. Ortega and Sanchez prepared their retaliation, confident they could crush the resistance at Cedar Grove. But in his office, Bob Anderson reviewed his plans with meticulous care. Every move was calculated, every contingency covered. "They think they're hunting us," Bob said quietly to himself, "but they've already walked into the trap." As the first signs of dawn crept over the horizon, Bob stood by the window, watching the runway below. The coming battle would be the most dangerous yet, but he was ready. "Let them come," he murmured. "This time, we're ending it." The night was calm at Cedar Grove Airport, but Bob Anderson's instincts told him otherwise. Standing in the shadow of his hangar, he scanned the perimeter, watching for signs of movement. The steel riders and their cartel handlers wouldn't stay idle for long. The cartel's failure at the airport had humiliated them, and men like Miguel Sanchez and his boss Ortega thrived on control. When that control was threatened, retaliation was inevitable. Bob leaned against a stack of crates, the cold metal pressing against his back. His eyes were sharp, calculating. He wasn't just preparing for an attack. He was anticipating it, like a chess player seeing moves several steps ahead. A low rumble in the distance broke the stillness. Bob's sharp ears caught it before anyone else. Motorcycles. Several of them. Within minutes, the steel riders arrived, their engines growling as they rolled onto the tarmac. But this time, it wasn't just the usual crew. The man who dismounted from the lead bike was different. He wasn't adorned with the usual gang regalia, nor did he carry himself with the bravado of Wolf or the desperation of Sanchez. This man moved with a controlled intensity, his cold eyes scanning the area like a predator assessing its prey. Bob recognized him immediately. "Storm," he muttered under his breath. Kevin, Storm Reeves, a former Special Forces operative, had once served alongside Bob during their time in the Air Force. But while Bob had upheld the honor and discipline of their service, Storm had taken a darker path. Dishonorably discharged after a botched mission in Southeast Asia, he had vanished into the criminal underworld. Now, it seemed, he had resurfaced as the cartel's enforcer. Storm's voice cut through the night as he addressed the group. "Anderson's not just some old man. He's a threat. But threats can be eliminated." Wolf snickered. "We've been saying that all along." Storm ignored him, his piercing gaze fixed on the hangar. "This isn't a biker gang's game anymore. From now on, we do this my way." Bob watched from the shadows, his mind racing. Storm's presence changed everything. This wasn't just about drugs or smuggling routes anymore. It was personal. Inside the hangar, Catherine Walsh and Michael O'Brien were reviewing surveillance footage when Bob entered. "We've got company," Bob said, his voice calm but urgent. "Storm's here." Catherine's head snapped up. "Storm? You mean?" "Yes," Bob interrupted. And he's not here to negotiate. Michael frowned, his grease-streaked hands tightening into fists. Storm's the kind of guy who burns everything down if he can't control it. Catherine stood, grabbing her radio. We need to call this in. If Storm's involved, the cartel's escalating faster than we thought. Bob shook his head. Not yet. If we act too soon, we'll spook them. Let Storm think he's in charge. That's when he'll make a mistake. Later that night, Bob slipped away from the hangar and into the shadows. He moved with the precision of a man who had spent years navigating dangerous terrain. Near the airport's edge, he spotted Razor, one of the younger members of the Steel Riders, lingering near his bike. Razor wasn't like the others. Bob had noticed his hesitation during previous encounters, the way his eyes darted nervously, as if questioning the path he was on. Bob approached quietly, his voice low. Razor. The young biker jumped but didn't run. What do you want, old man? I want to know why you're still here, Bob said. You don't strike me as the kind who enjoys running drugs for a cartel. Razor shifted uncomfortably. You don't know anything about me? I know you've got a family, Bob replied. A younger sister, right? Lives out in Billings. You really want her growing up with a brother who's part of this? Razor's jaw tightened. What do you want from me? Bob stepped closer, his voice steady. Information. I need to know what Storm and Sanchez are planning. And in return, I'll make sure you and your sister are safe. Razor hesitated, but the weight of his choices was clear in his eyes. They're planning something big. Storm says it'll send a message to anyone who tries to stand in their way. What kind of message? Explosives, Razor admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. They're planning to take out the airport. Back in the hangar, Bob relayed Razor's information to Catherine and Michael. They're going to hit us with everything they've got, Catherine said, pacing. We need to evacuate and call in reinforcements. Bob shook his head. If we run, they'll own this place by morning. We stay, and we fight smart. Michael grinned. I've still got some tricks up my sleeve. Give me a few hours, and this place will be a fortress. Catherine frowned. And what about Razor? Can we trust him? Bob's voice was firm. He made his choice. Now it's up to us to make sure he doesn't regret it. The next morning, Storm and Sanchez arrived at the airport with a convoy of vehicles. Armed men disembarked, setting up a perimeter as Wolf barked orders. Storm, however, remained focused, his eyes scanning for any sign of Bob. Inside the hangar, Bob and Catherine watched on surveillance monitors. Here we go, Bob muttered. Storm stepped forward, a megaphone in hand. Anderson, you've got one last chance. Come out now, and we'll make this quick. Otherwise, we'll burn you out. Bob stepped outside, his calm demeanor masking the tension in his chest. Still using scare tactics, Storm? I thought you were better than that. Storm's lips curled into a cold smile. You always underestimated me, Anderson. That's why I'm still here, and you're hiding in a tin shack. Funny, Bob replied. I thought it was because you couldn't handle the real fight. Storm's expression darkened. Enough talk. Let's finish this. As Storm signaled his men to advance, the ground beneath them erupted in controlled explosions. Michael's traps, expertly placed, sent shockwaves through the convoy. Chaos erupted as cartel members scrambled for cover. From inside the hangar, Catherine and her team launched their counteroffensive. Using non-lethal measures and well-timed tactics, they disoriented the attackers, forcing them into defensive positions. In the midst of the chaos, Razor turned on his own gang, helping Bob neutralize key operatives. Storm, realizing his plan was unraveling, confronted Bob directly. The two men faced off, decades of history between them. You could have been on top, Anderson, Storm growled, raising his weapon. Bob didn't flinch. And you could have been better than this. The confrontation ended swiftly, with Bob disarming Storm and Catherine's team, taking him into custody. As the dust settled, Sanchez and a few of his men managed to escape, but their resources were depleted, their confidence shattered. Catherine approached Bob, her expression a mix of relief and determination. We've got Storm, and we've sent a message. But Sanchez won't stop here. Bob nodded. Then we'll be ready. They think they're out of moves, but the game's just beginning. As the sun set over Cedar Grove, the airport stood battered but intact, a testament to the power of resilience and the strength of a community united against fear. The calm after the ambush at Cedar Grove Airport was deceptive. While Storm's capture had delivered a significant blow to the cartel's operations, Miguel Sanchez had escaped, and Bob Anderson knew it wouldn't be long before the cartel retaliated. In the airport office, Catherine Walsh and Bob reviewed new intelligence gathered from Storm's interrogation. The former Special Forces operative, now shackled in a secure federal facility, had grudgingly revealed fragments of the cartel's broader strategy. They're consolidating forces across 3 states, Catherine explained, pointing to red markers on a regional map. Sanchez is pulling in every resource he can: bikers, cartel contractors, and even corrupt officials. Bob leaned over the map, his expression grim. He's trying to re-establish control. They need a win, and they'll stop at nothing to get it. Miles away, Sanchez met with Ortega in a high-rise overlooking the sprawling cityscape of Phoenix. Ortega was every bit the cartel commander, calm, ruthless, and calculating. His sharp suit contrasted with Sanchez's disheveled appearance, a reflection of the latter's recent failures. "You let Anderson humiliate us," Ortega said, his voice sharp and controlled. "The Steel Riders are falling apart, and Storm's capture has made us look weak." Sanchez stiffened. "Anderson's no ordinary target. He's former Air Force, Special Operations. The man's a tactician." Ortega's eyes narrowed. "I don't care if he's a retired general. This ends now. Use everything: money, muscle, officials on our payroll. Crush Cedar Grove and remind everyone why the Navarro cartel cannot be challenged." Sanchez nodded, already formulating a plan. "Understood." Back at the airport, Sheriff Cooper arrived with troubling news. "We've got reports from nearby towns," Cooper said. "Businesses are shutting down under threats, truck stops are being vandalized, and we've had 3 local officials resign. They're clearing the way for something big." Catherine folded her arms, her brow furrowed. "They're destabilizing the region. Classic cartel tactics: create chaos, then swoop in to take control." Bob looked out the window toward the runway, his gaze distant. "They're setting the stage for a show of force. When they come, it'll be loud and brutal." Michael O'Brien, stepping into the office, broke the silence. "Then we make sure their show has the worst reviews in history." The next night, the attack came. Cedar Grove was plunged into chaos as Sanchez and his forces launched a multi-pronged assault. Motorcycles roared into town, accompanied by black SUVs carrying cartel operatives. Explosions rocked key infrastructure, including power transformers and communication towers, leaving the town in darkness. At the airport, Bob's team was ready. Using generators to maintain power, they activated pre-installed floodlights, illuminating the runway and revealing a swarm of approaching vehicles. "They're not holding back," Catherine said, gripping her radio. "Neither are we," Bob replied, his voice calm but firm. As the cartel forces advanced, Bob's defenses sprang into action. Michael's carefully placed traps disrupted the convoy, forcing vehicles into choke points where agents and deputies were waiting. Sheriff Cooper coordinated his team with precision, using the limited resources of Cedar Grove's law enforcement to hold back the assault. Bob, armed with his military experience, directed the counterattack like a battlefield commander. He used Sanchez's tactics against him, exploiting their aggressiveness to lure them into ambushes. Despite the chaos, Sanchez remained determined. He personally led a group of operatives toward the airport hangar, intending to destroy it and cripple the town's resistance. Inside the hangar, Diana Martinez worked frantically to secure sensitive equipment while monitoring the surveillance feeds. She spotted Sanchez on the monitors and radioed Bob. "He's coming for the hangar, Bob." Sanchez is leading the charge himself. Bob grabbed his rifle and motioned for Catherine to follow. "Let's greet him properly." As Sanchez's group approached the hangar, Bob and Catherine engaged them in a fierce firefight. Using the element of surprise, they disabled 2 SUVs and scattered the operatives. Sanchez, taking cover behind a stack of crates, yelled into his radio, "Get reinforcements here now." But reinforcements weren't coming. Bob had anticipated the call and jammed their communications. "You're running out of options, Sanchez," Bob called out, his voice echoing in the chaos. You don't know who you're dealing with, Sanchez shouted back. I know exactly who you are, Bob replied, stepping out of cover. You're a man who thought he could intimidate a small town and got outplayed. Furious, Sanchez fired at Bob, who sidestepped and returned fire, grazing Sanchez's shoulder. Catherine moved swiftly, flanking him and disarming him before he could react further. It's over, Catherine said, her weapon trained on Sanchez. Sanchez, clutching his wounded arm, glared at Bob. You think this changes anything? You've just made yourself a bigger target. Ortega will never stop. Bob leaned in close, his voice low. Neither will we. The cartel forces, now leaderless and disorganized, began retreating. Sheriff Cooper's deputies and the FBI team rounded up those who didn't escape, while Michael secured the perimeter. By dawn, Cedar Grove was quiet again. The town was battered, but it had held. In the aftermath, Bob, Catherine, and Sheriff Cooper debriefed in the office. Sanchez is in custody, and we've crippled their operations in the area, Catherine said. But Ortega's still out there. And he'll be coming for us, Bob added. Cooper nodded. You think he'll come himself? Bob's eyes narrowed. He'll have no choice. And when he does, we'll be ready. Elsewhere, Ortega sat in his luxurious office, listening as one of his lieutenants delivered the bad news. Sanchez failed. Cedar Grove held. Ortega's face darkened. Anderson's not just some old pilot. He's a problem. Prepare the final phase. No more games. As the lieutenant left, Ortega leaned back in his chair, his mind already calculating his next move. Let's see how strong this small town really is, he murmured to himself. At Cedar Grove Airport, Bob stood on the runway, watching the sunrise. Behind him, the town was rallying, rebuilding what had been damaged. They thought they could break us, Bob said to Catherine, who joined him. They were wrong, she replied. Bob's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. He knew the battle was far from over, but Cedar Grove had proven one thing. It wasn't going down without a fight. The night at Cedar Grove Airport was deceptively quiet. In the aftermath of Sanchez's capture and the cartel's retreat, the small town had been thrust into an uneasy calm. But Bob Anderson knew better. The Navarro cartel wouldn't let this humiliation go unanswered, and Ortega's next move would be nothing short of catastrophic. In the dimly lit hangar, Bob, Catherine Walsh, Sheriff Cooper, and Michael O'Brien huddled around a tactical map spread across a workbench. Ortega's not going to waste time on small moves anymore, Bob began. He's coming to finish this. He'll bring every resource he has left. And if Ortega himself gets involved, this isn't just a battle for Cedar Grove anymore, Catherine added. It's a statement. To them, to us, to anyone watching. Michael leaned forward, his voice grim. They'll turn this town into a war zone if it means reestablishing their control. You think we can hold them off again? We don't need to hold them off, Bob replied, his eyes fixed on the map. We need to draw them in and make sure they don't walk away this time. Meanwhile, in a luxury villa across the border, Ortega was planning his own move. His trusted advisors stood in silence as he paced, his frustration evident. Cedar Grove was supposed to be a simple operation, Ortega said, his voice cold and measured. But Anderson has turned it into an international embarrassment. One of his lieutenants, a wiry man named Alvarez, spoke hesitantly. Sanchez underestimated him. We won't make the same mistake. Ortega stopped pacing and looked at Alvarez. No, you won't, because I'm handling this personally. The room fell silent as Ortega leaned over a map of Cedar Grove. We'll mobilize everything. Soldiers, equipment, contractors. This ends in one decisive strike. At the airport, preparations were in full swing. Michael installed additional surveillance equipment, fortifying the perimeter with makeshift barricades and concealed traps. Catherine coordinated with FBI units, ensuring reinforcements were stationed nearby. Sheriff Cooper organized local volunteers, many of whom were veterans, to provide additional manpower. As the sun set, Diana Martinez approached Bob, who was overseeing the setup of floodlights along the runway. Bob, this is getting too big, Diana said, her voice filled with concern. We're not just fighting a cartel anymore. This feels like a war. Bob paused, his weathered hands gripping a wrench. It's always been a war, Diana. It's just that now, they're desperate enough to show it. Hours later, in a secure room at the airport, Catherine received a disturbing update over her encrypted laptop. "Bob," she called, her voice tense. He entered the room, his expression calm but alert. "What is it?" Catherine turned the screen toward him. "Ortega's made contact with someone inside the government. High-level corruption. They're clearing the way for him. Federal oversight is being blocked, and local law enforcement is being told to stand down." Bob studied the screen, his mind already racing. "He's pulling strings to isolate us. He wants to make sure no one interferes when he makes his move." Catherine frowned. "Then we need to act fast. Once Ortega arrives, it'll be too late to stop him." Bob nodded. "That's why we're not waiting for him to make the first move." The next day, Bob and Catherine coordinated a preemptive strike. Using the intelligence gathered from Sanchez, they identified key cartel operations in neighboring towns. A series of coordinated raids disrupted supply lines, destroyed safe houses, and captured several of Ortega's men. News of the raids spread quickly, drawing attention from law enforcement agencies across the region. Ortega, now fully aware of the disruption, was forced to accelerate his plans. In his villa, Ortega's calm facade cracked as he received report after report of setbacks. "Anderson," he muttered under his breath, his voice filled with venom. Turning to Alvarez, Ortega gave a single command: "Assemble everyone. We leave tonight." As night fell over Cedar Grove, the airport was transformed into a fortress. Floodlights illuminated the runway, and every strategic position was manned by volunteers, deputies, and FBI agents. In the control tower, Catherine monitored the surveillance feeds, her focus unwavering. On the outskirts of town, the low hum of engines signaled the arrival of Ortega's forces. Dozens of SUVs, trucks, and motorcycles moved with military precision, carrying heavily armed cartel operatives and hired mercenaries. From the hangar, Bob watched their approach through binoculars. He handed them to Michael. "They brought everything," Michael said, his tone a mix of awe and apprehension. "Good," Bob replied. "The bigger they are, the harder they fall." Ortega's convoy stopped just outside the airport perimeter. Stepping out of an armored SUV, Ortega surveyed the scene. He was flanked by Alvarez and several of his most trusted enforcers. "Light it up," Ortega ordered. Fireworks filled the air, bright bursts of light and sound meant to intimidate. But Bob's team stood firm, their positions unmoving. Ortega smirked. "So, this is Anderson's big stand." He raised a megaphone and called out, "Anderson, I know you're in there. Let's end this. Come out, surrender, and I'll make it quick." Bob stepped out into the open, his calm demeanor unwavering. "You came all this way for me, Ortega. Let's not disappoint you." Ortega's smirk faded slightly as he studied Bob. "You've caused me a lot of trouble, old man. But trouble ends tonight." Bob's voice was steady. "No, Ortega. Trouble starts tonight." With a nod from Bob, the airport's defenses sprang to life. Floodlights blinded the cartel's operatives, and Michael's traps, explosives, spike strips, and barriers created chaos among the vehicles. Deputies and FBI agents opened fire with precision, targeting tires and engines to disable the convoy. The cartel, caught off guard, struggled to regroup. Ortega barked orders, his calm demeanor giving way to anger. Bob, moving like the soldier he once was, led a small team through the chaos. Using his intimate knowledge of the terrain, he flanked Ortega's position, cutting him off from his reinforcements. Ortega and Bob finally came face to face near the hangar. Both men were bruised and battered, their entourages reduced to a handful of loyal fighters. "You should have stayed retired, Anderson," Ortega growled, raising his weapon. Bob didn't flinch. "And you should have stayed out of Cedar Grove." The two men exchanged fire, their movements precise and calculated. Bob's years of training and experience gave him the upper hand, and he managed to disarm Ortega, pinning him against a crate. "It's over, Ortega," Bob said, his voice firm. Ortega sneered. "You think this changes anything? Another will rise to take my place." Bob tightened his grip. "Maybe, but not here. Not tonight." With Ortega captured, the remaining cartel forces scattered. Federal reinforcements, alerted by Catherine's team, arrived to secure the area and take the captured operatives into custody. As dawn broke, Cedar Grove stood victorious. The airport, though scarred, had held firm. Catherine approached Bob, exhaustion evident on her face. "We did it." Bob nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. For now. Diana joined them, her voice filled with hope. "Do you think they'll come back?" Bob took a deep breath. "If they do, we'll be ready." Cedar Grove isn't just a town anymore. It's a message. And the world is watching. As the sun rose higher, illuminating the resilient town, Bob allowed himself a small smile. The battle was won, but the fight for justice was far from over. The morning after Ortega's capture, Cedar Grove awoke to a town transformed. Though the signs of battle were evident, burned-out vehicles, bullet-riddled walls, and scattered debris, a palpable sense of victory hung in the air. The people of Cedar Grove, who had once been paralyzed by fear, now walked with newfound purpose. At the airport, federal agents worked tirelessly to process the captured cartel operatives and dismantle the remaining traps. Catherine Walsh stood at the center of the activity, giving orders and overseeing the transport of evidence. Bob Anderson, meanwhile, stood on the runway with Sheriff Cooper and Michael O'Brien, surveying the aftermath. "We won the battle," Cooper said, "but I've been in this town long enough to know that doesn't mean the war's over." Bob nodded. "They'll regroup, and they'll try to rebuild. Cartels like Navarro don't just disappear. But this time, we've given them something they've never had before: doubt." Elsewhere, in a secure federal facility, Ortega sat in a stark interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the table. The once imposing cartel commander now looked worn, his sharp suit traded for an orange jumpsuit. Catherine entered the room, accompanied by two agents. "You've got two options," Catherine said, dropping a thick file onto the table. "Cooperate, or spend the rest of your life in a cell." Ortega leaned back, his expression unreadable. "You think this is a victory? Taking me down doesn't stop the cartel. It doesn't even slow us down." Catherine smirked. "Maybe not, but you know what does? This." She opened the file, revealing intercepted communications, financial records, and testimony from captured operatives. Ortega's eyes flickered with recognition as he realized the extent of the evidence against him. "You think you can dismantle an empire with a few documents?" "We already have," Catherine replied. "And you're going to help us finish the job?" Back in Cedar Grove, Bob and Diana met with community leaders in the town hall. The room buzzed with conversation, the townspeople energized by their recent victory. "We've shown the cartel we're not afraid," Bob said, addressing the group. "But that doesn't mean they're done with us. They'll regroup, and they'll look for weaknesses. We can't give them any." A hand shot up in the crowd. It was Jake, the owner of the local hardware store. "What can we do to stop them? We're just a small town." "We fight smart," Bob replied. "We keep building on what we've started. Communication, vigilance, and unity. That's how we keep them out." Diana added, "We've already set up surveillance systems around the airport, and we're working on expanding them into town. But we'll need volunteers to help monitor them." Several hands went up, including Jake's. Meanwhile, Catherine received a troubling update from her superiors. A new cartel lieutenant, Ricardo Mendez, had taken control of Navarro's operations. Ruthless and ambitious, Mendez was known for his scorched earth tactics. "He's not going to play games like Ortega did," Catherine told Bob. "If Mendez comes, he'll bring chaos with him." "Then we prepare for chaos," Bob replied. As the town rallied to secure its future, Bob and his team worked tirelessly to fortify Cedar Grove. Michael repaired damaged equipment and reinforced key infrastructure, while Sheriff Cooper organized neighborhood patrols. One evening, as Bob inspected the airport's perimeter, he found Razor waiting for him. The young biker had been instrumental in helping Bob during the last battle, but his loyalty was still a question mark. "What's on your mind, Razor?" Bob asked. "I want to help," Razor said, his voice steady. "I've seen what the cartel does to people. I don't want to be part of that anymore." Bob studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but understand this. Helping us means putting a target on your back. Are you ready for that?" Razor didn't hesitate. "I've made worse choices. This one feels right." Over the next few weeks, Cedar Grove became a symbol of resistance. News of the town's defiance spread, drawing attention from other communities facing similar threats. Local business owners banded together, forming a coalition to share resources and protect each other. Federal agencies, inspired by Cedar Grove's example, ramped up their efforts to dismantle the Navarro cartel. Catherine's team coordinated a series of raids across the region, targeting supply routes, money laundering operations, and hidden safe houses. But the cartel fought back. In one particularly bold move, Mendez ordered an attack on a nearby town that had begun organizing its own resistance. The attack left several injured and sent a clear message: no one was safe. The news reached Cedar Grove the next morning. The town gathered at the airport, where Bob addressed them. "This is what they do," Bob said. "They try to scare us, break us, make us feel powerless. But we've already proven we're stronger than their fear. They can't intimidate all of us," Diana added. "If we stand together, they lose their power." The crowd murmured in agreement, their resolve hardening. That night, Bob and Catherine worked late in the airport office, poring over maps and intelligence reports. "Mendez won't stop until he makes an example out of Cedar Grove," Catherine said. "We need to hit him before he hits us." Bob nodded, his mind racing. "We'll draw him out, make him overextend, just like Ortega did. But this time, we take the whole operation down." "And how do we do that?" Catherine asked. Bob leaned back, a faint smile on his face. "By turning their own tactics against them." As the stars illuminated the quiet town, Cedar Grove prepared for its next fight. The people had found their strength, and the cartel was about to learn a hard lesson. Cedar Grove wasn't just a town anymore. It was a movement. Cedar Grove stood on the precipice of yet another storm. The town had transformed into a fortress of resilience, but the Navarro cartel wasn't finished. Ricardo Mendez, Ortega's ruthless successor, had declared his intent to make Cedar Grove the ultimate example of what happens to those who resist. In the airport office, Bob Anderson and Catherine Walsh strategized late into the night. Maps, intercepted communications, and surveillance photos covered the table. "Mendez is no Ortega," Catherine said, her tone grim. "He's brutal, unpredictable, and he's already mobilizing everything the cartel has left." Bob studied the map, tracing routes with his finger. "Unpredictable doesn't mean careless. He'll want to strike big, something that can't be ignored. That means he'll go after key infrastructure, power, water, communications." Catherine nodded. "We've already seen it. He's targeting nearby towns, cutting them off before moving in. Cedar Grove's next." Bob's voice was steady, but his words carried weight. "Then we draw him in and make this his last move." The next day, Cedar Grove was a hive of activity. Sheriff Cooper coordinated with local volunteers and federal agents to reinforce the town's defenses. Michael O'Brien and Razor worked on installing additional traps and surveillance systems around critical points, including the water treatment plant and the power station. In the center of town, Diana Martinez organized a meeting with local business owners, rallying them to stand together. "This isn't just about Cedar Grove," she said. "It's about showing everyone that communities can fight back." Meanwhile, Bob reached out to old contacts in the military and law enforcement. Using favors earned from decades of service, he secured access to equipment and intelligence that would prove invaluable in the coming fight. Miles away, Ricardo Mendez was finalizing his plans. In a remote compound surrounded by armed guards, he addressed his most trusted lieutenants. "Cedar Grove embarrassed us," Mendez began, his voice cold and commanding. "They made us look weak. That ends now." One of the lieutenants hesitated. "Anderson has proven resourceful. He's turned their entire town into a stronghold." Mendez smirked. "Let him fortify. It won't save them. We're not coming in waves like Ortega did. We'll hit them all at once, every angle, every target. And when we're done, there won't be anything left to fight for." The lieutenant nodded and Mendez laid out his plan. Simultaneous strikes on the airport, power grid, water supply, and key town leaders. The goal wasn't just to defeat Cedar Grove, but to erase it. Back in Cedar Grove, Catherine intercepted a crucial piece of intelligence, a coded transmission indicating Mendez's forces were already on the move. She rushed to the hangar, where Bob and Michael were preparing supplies. "They're coming," Catherine said, her voice urgent. multiple convoys, converging from 3 directions. Mendez isn't holding back. Bob nodded, his expression unreadable. Then neither do we. He turned to Michael. Is everything in place? Michael grinned, wiping grease from his hands. Ready and waiting. They won't know what hit them. As night fell, the first signs of the cartel's approach appeared on the horizon. Headlights stretched like an unbroken line of light, accompanied by the distant hum of engines. In the control tower, Diana monitored the surveillance feeds. They're splitting into groups, she reported over the radio. One heading for the water plant, another for the power station, and the rest are coming straight for the airport. Bob responded calmly. Stick to the plan. Everyone knows their positions. Sheriff Cooper and his deputies took up defensive positions at the water plant, while Catherine and a team of federal agents guarded the power station. Bob, Michael, and a small group of volunteers remained at the airport, ready to face the main force. The attack began just after midnight. At the water plant, Sheriff Cooper's team engaged the cartel operatives in a fierce firefight. The cartel had brought heavy weapons, but Cooper's team used the terrain to their advantage, ambushing the attackers and forcing them into retreat. At the power station, Catherine's team faced a relentless assault. Cartel mercenaries attempted to breach the facility, but Catherine's tactical acumen and the team's preparation held the line. Smoke and gunfire filled the air as agents repelled wave after wave. Meanwhile, the airport became the focal point of the battle. Mendez himself led the charge, his convoy barreling onto the runway under cover of darkness. Inside the hangar, Bob and his team watched the approach on surveillance monitors. They're coming in hard, Razor said, gripping his weapon. Good, Bob replied. They're walking into a trap. As the convoy neared the hangar, Michael activated the first line of defenses. Explosives concealed beneath the tarmac detonated, disabling several vehicles and throwing the convoy into disarray. Floodlights blazed to life, exposing the attackers and blinding them. Now, Bob commanded. His team opened fire, targeting the remaining vehicles and forcing the cartel operatives to take cover. Mendez, undeterred, barked orders to his men and pressed forward. The battle raged for hours, with both sides sustaining heavy losses. Bob and Mendez eventually came face to face near the hangar's entrance. You've cost me everything, Anderson, Mendez snarled, raising his weapon. Bob stared him down, his voice calm. You did that yourself when you brought this fight to Cedar Grove. Mendez fired, but Bob anticipated the move, sidestepping and disarming him in a single motion. The two men grappled, their fight a brutal clash of experience and raw aggression. In the end, Bob prevailed, pinning Mendez to the ground. It's over, Bob said, his voice steady. Not for long, Mendez spat. Someone else will take my place. Bob shook his head. Maybe, but not here. Not today. By dawn, the battle was over. Mendez and his remaining operatives were in custody, their forces scattered. Federal reinforcements arrived to secure the town and transport the prisoners. As the sun rose over Cedar Grove, its people began to emerge, tired but victorious. The scars of the battle were evident, but so was the strength of the community. Catherine approached Bob, who stood by the runway, watching the aftermath. They're finished, she said. With Mendez and Ortega out of the picture, the Navarro cartel is done. For now, Bob replied. But there's always another threat. That's why we stay ready. In the days that followed, Cedar Grove became a symbol of resistance, its story spreading across the country. Communities everywhere took inspiration from its defiance, proving that even the most powerful criminal empires could be brought down by ordinary people standing together. As the town began to rebuild, Bob allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. Standing on the runway, he looked out at the horizon, knowing that while this chapter had ended, the fight for justice was never truly over. Weeks after the final battle at Cedar Grove, the town was returning to a semblance of normalcy. The scars of the cartel's assault, shattered windows, charred vehicles, and bullet-ridden walls were being repaired by the hands of the very people the cartel had sought to intimidate. Bob Anderson stood at the edge of the airport's runway, watching the sun rise. In the golden light, he saw volunteers repainting fences, children laughing as they helped collect debris, and families rebuilding homes together. This is what they never understood, Bob said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. You can't break people who stand together. In the airport office, Catherine Walsh was finalizing a report for federal authorities. The Navarro cartel's operations were in shambles. With Ortega and Mendez in custody, the cartel's hierarchy had been gutted, and key operatives were cooperating to save themselves. Catherine handed the final file to Diana Martinez. This is everything: financial trails, communications, names of corrupted officials. It's all there. Diana flipped through the file, a mix of awe and relief on her face. We didn't just stop them here. We tore down their entire network. Bob entered, his demeanor calm but resolute. How long before another group tries to fill the vacuum? Catherine frowned. That's always a possibility. But with what we've exposed, it won't be easy for anyone to step into their shoes. And if they do, Bob said, they'll know what happens when they underestimate people like us. The morning gave way to a ceremony in the heart of Cedar Grove. The townspeople had gathered to dedicate a memorial, a polished stone monument etched with the names of those who had stood against the cartel and fought to protect their community.